Welcome back to Lippincott Talk. My name is Josiah Lippincott. Today I want to talk about energy policy, public utilities, and outages. And you may be saying, that sounds like a really wonky topic. Why are you covering that today of all days? What's the point? Why not talk about Iran or Israel or foreign policy or mass migration? Why zero in on this issue? Well, first of all, it directly impacts my life. And it has done so in a very poignant and clear way in the last week. So over 4th of July weekend, a windstorm swept through southern Michigan, and about 350,000 Michiganders lost power, many for several days. And among those were myself and my friends here in Hillsdale. And I'll just be blunt, and I watched a bunch of my friends lose money from lost food, from refrigerators going out. They had to leave town because their homes were so hot that they weren't able to sleep at night, or it was very difficult, especially with small children. And, this is an issue that touches me directly. It's a sign of what I've seen one astute commentator call the enshittification of American public life, where stuff just stops working and it isn't obvious why, and it makes all of our lives worse, and it just feels like we're locked into decline. And what I want to do in this show here today is to go through this issue in a clear and serious way to show the origins of this particular problem. Why is it that outages have continually affected Michigan over the last several years, and what can be done to fix it? I would say the worst outage that I've experienced here was one in February of 2023. There was an ice storm. My wife and I lost power for 2 full days, and it was horrible. We had a newborn at the time. It was bitterly cold. It was difficult even driving out of town. The gas stations were closed. There was fallen trees everywhere. There was ice everywhere. It was a bad time, right? And I'm glad that my wife and I were able to get out. But by the end of it, we had spent probably well over $1,000 between the hotel rooms, the lost food, the travel, the lost work time. Our inability to go and do, and engage in like daily activities in a normal way was impinged by this crisis, right? This that just came out of nowhere. And the question I've posed to myself is, why is it that these things are happening? What is the solution? And I will tell you, having done my wonky policy research, this is a problem created by the federal and state government. And it can be fixed by removing these regulations and allowing the market instead of the state to dictate energy prices. And the reason I'm zeroing in on this topic, and the reason I've zeroed in on a number of economic topics over the last year, is this is what people want to talk about, right? There's such a focus on prices, wages, inflation, economic growth, jobs. There's, I think, a sense that I really feel, especially online, especially among the young, that what's really driving them to, get interested in right-wing politics or vote for Trump or get interested in immigration is it's driven by concerns over the cost of living, over economic issues. And that's a legitimate thing, but I think it's important to separate out why it is that there are these economic problems and what we can do to fix them. And I think that means identifying the chain of causation correctly. Like, why is this problem here, and what are the solutions? So what I want to do today in this show is to explain why it is that we don't have a free market in energy here in the state of Michigan, and we'd be better off if we had one. The regulated, state-sponsored monopolies for consumers' energy and DTE, as well as federal regulation of the grid and how energy is exchanged, makes all energy more expensive, and it makes life worse for myself, for my family, for my friends. And in reality and in truth, this is an easy-to-solve problem. It can be done, and we should do it. I want to encourage, what I really want you to take away from this episode here today is that life can get better. There is a powerful impulse towards more production, to things being improved, for the quality of life going up. And there are institutions and individuals standing in the way. And if you remove those barriers, then things can get better. A lot of this is just simply artificial. We don't have to live this way. There really is a fix everything button that if you press it, And, regarding this issue at least, you can make life way, way better. And that's a hopeful thing. That's something that brings me optimism. And I want you to share that as well. As always, I just want to show you the rest of the story and the way that there's hope out there. Things can get better. I think one of the most powerful things that Trump talked about in his 2024 run was the idea of a new American golden age. I want that new golden age, and I want to help explain how we can get there. So this is a fundamentally wonky topic. It is easy to get lost in the weeds of the different acronyms, the different institutions. But the thing, and I want to avoid that. My goal here today is to just give a clear, overarching explanation of what's going on. And here in Michigan, I can tell you exactly why it is that we keep having major outages. It is because Consumers Energy and DTE both have state-sponsored monopolies. Those monopolies, the state sets how much money the utilities are able to make every single year. The incentive structure inside of the law itself prioritizes, or the way the equation is set up for them to make money is such that ongoing maintenance is not as profitable for these utilities as new capital expenditure. So what they do is, instead of fixing their existing power lines, they end up spending a bunch of money on building capital goods that they're able to charge consumers through rate increases in order to develop. And I just want to say, this whole system is stupid, it's corrupt, it should never have been made, it's not working, right? So much of public utility regulation is born out of a progressive era concern with protecting workers and preventing evil monopolies and trusts, the evil trusts, and the robber barons, right? Robber barons are going to steal from consumers. And these individuals are dangerous. And what was needed was massive government regulation of these natural monopolies. The idea being, if you had technical experts from the government involved, then you wouldn't see the economic problems and economic power coalescing into a few hands. I think this progressive era argument was profoundly stupid. It was a massive failure, and it violated the rights of Americans in regards to their property. And this is a huge problem. And the more I think about it, and the more I think about the New Deal and the progressive era and our own modern state and COVID, what's highlighted to me is just the extent to which the growth of the American state in the late 19th and early 20th century was a specifically left-wing project that made our lives worse. And all of this stuff ties into the growth of the state. Increasingly, I see this. Mass immigration, our wars abroad, high taxes here at home, high regulation here at home, corporate interests getting special benefits, all of these things go together. All of them go together. What I want to highlight here today is, specifically in Michigan, the corrupt and broken relationship between the utility companies and their state regulators is making our lives worse, and it doesn't have to be that way. Just a quick overview, as much as I can give it. The problem really in Michigan stems from the Michigan Public Service Commission. It was created in 1939. It's sort of the high water mark of progressive era regulation of utilities. And the MPSC, this Michigan Public Service Commission, this is the law that created them. I mean, just hear how sweeping these powers really are. This is MCL 460.6 for any lawyers in the audience. It says, the Public Service Commission is vested with the power and jurisdiction to regulate all rates, fares, fees, charges, services, rules, conditions of service, and all other matters pertaining to the formation, operation, or direction of public utilities. And then it defines what a public utility is. And it just says here that the commission is further granted the power and jurisdiction to hear and pass upon all matters pertaining to necessary or incident to the regulation of public utilities, including electric, light, and power companies, whether private, corporate, or cooperative, water, telegraph, oil, gas, and pipeline companies, motor carriers, private wastewater treatment facilities, and all public transportation and communication agencies other than railroads and railroad companies. Wow, right? The MPSC is an incredibly powerful government entity. It has the ability to tell these companies what they are allowed to charge consumers to provide those services. And it covers a whole swath of the most important entities, or some of the most important entities in Michigan life, right? And the whole idea, and you look at this, and again, the seeds of COVID regulation, of sweeping administrative powers that can be turned on and off at the flip of a switch, goes back a long way into the heart of the progressive era. And, what's animating the creation of something like the MPSC is safetyism. And again, the idea that you can't trust the market process. You can't trust people to use their property and buy and sell without there being problems. And so the government needs to regulate and socialize or quasi-nationalize these corporations and entities in order to serve the public good. They're not private companies, they're public utilities, and therefore the progressive era state needs to regulate these entities. Well, this has been a huge problem, because part of what's going on here is that the Regulatory Commission ended up securing and protecting the existing incumbent power generation and public utility companies. So what's really going on is that the corporations, instead of being regulated, are actually securing for themselves a government-sponsored sinecure. In fact, this is in the origin of the word monopoly itself. So oftentimes, you'll hear people talk about monopoly as if you have like one producer of a good, and that's the definition of monopoly. That's not a good definition. Why? Because what does it mean to have a sole producer, and what does it mean to have one good? Because in one sense, let's say you own a home on a piece of land, and you're the landlord for that property. You have a monopoly on land at that address in that particular configuration. There's no other piece of land in the exact same place providing the exact same service and the same square footage, same location, same law, same everything, right? It's different. So in a way, that would be a monopoly good, right? But then again, that would mean every single person renting out a room is in some ways a monopolist on a given entity, right? Or a given piece of property or a given service, right? If you're in a town and you're the only gas station, don't you technically have a monopoly on that area, even if there's a gas station down the road? So the problem is, when thinking about monopolies, what happens in the mind is people zero in on this idea of like a corporation buying up everything and being able to lock out its competitors and raise rates as high as it wants. And this is a huge problem. In truth, the word monopoly is a government-sponsored privilege. And you can even hear it in the word itself. Monopoly, right? In politics, polis, city, power, that ending reveals the truth. Monopoly means really government grant of market share. So what the Michigan Public Services Commission really did was not to eliminate the possibility of monopolies, but rather made them mandatory under the law. In fact, competition between utilities over a same given area is illegal in the state of Michigan. So if you're in a Consumers Energy area, you are served by Consumers Energy. That's who you've got. There's a minor exception in the law for some people. There's like a 10% category where you can have overlap, but the core reality is where you can change producers, but the utility company still owns all the lines that lead up to your house. So functionally what's happening in Michigan is 90% of Michiganders are served by one of two companies, Consumers Energy, DTE. And it turns out they have state-sponsored monopolies on providing power to people's homes. Even if you go through one of the local municipal companies like BPU, which is what we have here in Hillsdale, the Board of Public Utilities, they buy all their power from Consumers Energy. So what happens here is that Consumers Energy under the law and DTE under the law are only allowed to make money with permission from the state regulatory agency. And there was a court case in the 1940s that helped set up, what the formula is. But functionally, these companies can only make a 10% rate of return on their capital invested. So there's what's called a rate base, which is the amount of capital that the state has defined that these companies have invested in the prudent provision of power. It's a net calculation, so depreciation is pulled out of the rate base, deferred income taxes, other stuff like that. But the core point is, and this is the key thing to take away, the public utility is allowed to make a certain amount of money every year through rate increases based off of an acceptable rate of return that's connected to the amount of capital that they expend on maintaining and building up their utility network. So I think right now, like DTE makes about 9.9%, but basically DTE has a base rate of about $26 billion in investment. And they're able to collect about $1.2 to $1.3 billion in authorized annual equity earnings. And so, the problem in all of this is that the energy company, the maintenance of their lines, the tree trimming around all of the lines, the power lines that go into consumers' homes, that isn't a qualifying capital expense. It's an ongoing maintenance expense that can be charged to consumers only once as a kind of annual fee. So the formula for how they calculate how to provide power disincentivizes the maintenance of their lines and of their system. So, I have this equation here in my thing. I don't know if I can find it in my notes. But functionally, the whole system is set up that the companies, the utility companies, do not have the incentive to fix up the power lines for the benefit of consumers. They can't make as much money doing that as they can spending on qualified expenses under the state regulation that allow them to charge consumers more money. So what's happening is these companies they're allowed to submit, I think once a year, they're allowed to submit for rate increases for their customers. So they've been doing this. Every year, DTE and Consumers Energy ask for higher rates for Michigan consumers for energy. And the reason they can do that and the way this formula has been set up is they emphasize spending on their rate base so that they can raise rates even higher under the allowable 10% or so that they're allowed to charge. And because they're monopolies with sole grants of the privilege of providing power to large, swaths of the Michigan population, they are not facing competitive pressure. The only thing that can keep them in check is the Michigan Public Services Commission. Guess what? They have a massive amount of political power, these utility companies, and they can functionally bribe and lobby their way into getting what they want. I won't use the word bribe. I'll take that back. Lobby, right? They're lobbying. They're lobbying for the ability to get the kind of rate increases that they want in order to produce returns for their shareholders. So this is a huge problem, right? Because they don't really suffer when power outages happen. It's not like they have competition. Yes, they get stuff working again, but it's not like if they fail to provide power, there's a competitor that can come in and compete with them across the same geographical area, providing more consistent power generation and more consistent power delivery or distribution. So there's been some auditing that's gone on here, and in 2023, after the major ice storm, and basically what it found is that for instance, DTE deprioritizes tree trimming because utilities can only recoup the maintenance cost from ratepayers. Instead, the cost of new equipment like transformers or power poles can be added to the company's rate base, earning its rate of return on investment, including 50% equity for stockholders. So that's just describing what I'm saying here is that, again, this is why DTE does not prioritize maintenance of its lines. It is incentivized by state regulation to invest in capital goods that allow it to raise rates on consumers. So this audit in 2023 found that the DTE and consumers were in the bottom 25% of utilities for customer average interruption data index, a measure of time that it takes to restore power. So again, they're not prioritizing it. And look at this. And this is great. This is amazing. from the same article, around 40% of DTE's substation transformers were installed before 1960, and some were put in place in 1924. It also found the company doesn't track the age of its service transformers. Yeah, I mean, it just shows, on the trees, and they're supposed to trim the trees around their power lines every 5 years is the cycle. They should go out and cut all the trees around their lines every 5 years. And what they found is both DTE and Consumers Energy were delaying to 7 and even up to 10 years. They keep deferring the maintenance because, again, and I found this here in my notes on the calculation for how this works, but they just are not able to make as much money doing maintenance as they can from increasing their rate base. So the formula for this case, the case in the 1944 is it's called now the Hope formula from this case. It says that revenue requirement, how much they can ask for, equals expenses plus depreciation plus taxes plus the rate base times the allowed rate of return. So again, expenses only get added once, but if you increase the rate base, it gets multiplied by the allowable rate of return. So when they ask for a rate increase, it's much better to spend money on capital expenses than it is on fixing the lines. So again, all of this is set up by regulation, and all of it could be fixed by getting rid of the regulation that creates the ability for these monopolies for providing power to make the kind of returns on investment that they're making. And some of this requires understanding just like how markets work. And I've just become, maybe it's Zohran Mamdani, and I think it's also just thinking through these problems more clearly. The free market, where consumers and producers voluntarily transact, is more efficient than government-allocated resources. Socialized or nationalized entities, government-sponsored monopolies are not as efficient because they do not face competitive pressure. In the free market, if you fail, consumers can switch to a different producer. They can reward someone who can promise and deliver higher quality service over another competitor. So that competitive process is about lowering costs for consumers while increasing durability and reliability. So in a competitive market, and a free market just means voluntary exchange and transaction. Sometimes you'll see people now in the kind of post-liberal movement that's happening on the right, or the illiberal movement, will deny the existence of the free market. There is no such thing as a free market, or that there's a necessity for these government regulations and massive progressive era state expansion. And I argue no. And I'm increasingly seeing just how destructive the abandonment of the market process really is. There's a lot of confusion. People confuse the market, which is a process, with the state, which is an institution. And that leads to a lot of error, and it leads to a lot of problems. And you see it especially on the left. They're crazy. But some of this is also happening on the right, where well-meaning conservatives are failing to distinguish between the market process and the movement of the state. And I will argue here and consistently, the state is the source of these problems. The expansion of the welfare state, of the managerial state, the safetiest state, all of that development has been bad for the freedom of Americans, and it's bad for the economy. It's bad for growth. It's bad for, the improvement of our lives. And, again, just what I'm trying to explain here, we are not better off because of the Michigan Public Services Commission. Its very way of calculating what we're allowed to be charged for energy is worse than the market solution. In a free market, you'd be allowed, as consumers or different entities or groups of consumers or municipalities could switch to a different producer. And even in a region where you just have one producer, the threat that venture capital could come in and undercut prices would be enough to put a lid on the ability of that power producer to raise prices. So in a free market, the power producer has every incentive to fix his lines, because every time there's an outage, it creates incentives for consumers to find a different producer for their power needs. And if you have another utility company that eventually it sees, look, there's enough of a marginal value to be captured here that they can swoop in and capture that value. The reason that monopolies aren't a big deal on the open market is because it isn't clear what the right price for a good is. What is the fair price? Well, what are consumers willing to pay? So let's say you have one utility in a given geographic area in an open market. They can raise rates and consumers have to pay higher costs. But then two things happen at once. First is if that, the evil corporation, right, raises the price, what happens? Well, consumers' response, first and foremost, if the government's not involved, would be to lower their usage at the higher price. And second of all, other companies will see an incentive to make profit. They'll see an opportunity for their company to swoop in and provide that service at a cheaper price that can capture the profit that this other corporation is leaving on the table by raising prices beyond what a normal rate of profit would be. So what happens in the free market is there's constant downward pressure on prices, constant, unrelenting. And entrepreneurial profit margins decline over time for the same reason. There's always more and more competitors. There's a ton of incentive to create efficiency gains that are better for the consumers of this service. Government is not like this. Government can lock in place a system that benefits producers at the expense of consumers who don't have a choice. And as a Michigander, I can't switch functionally to a different utility. I can't get cheaper power, even if it would be more economically viable to have that happen in a free market. I ran some numbers, using Claude, and just kind of back of the napkin paper math. But the cost of natural gas is really low, right? Like it's super cheap right now. There's a ton of it coming out of the southern United States and out of Texas. I think in the Permian Basin, they're just outright flaring off energy. I was looking at this. I think you're looking at about 18 cents per kilowatt hour is what it costs in Michigan right now for power production, and maybe only 2 cents of that is natural gas. And if you look at the capital expenses on a generator, if you take away all of the regulatory pressure, it looks like you could get power in half of what we pay right now, more like 9 or 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Even when you calculate out, getting like a 40 megawatt generator turbine at the current elevated prices because of the AI build out. If you do all of the math, what it ends up being, you look at it and you just say, even if you need a certain amount of standby power for surges in power production, if companies can sell back and forth in an open market that without regulated rates, it would drive the price down. There's so much margin built in by this regulatory capture, by the built-in profit margins for these companies. They just don't face competition. And one of the ultimate points in all of this is the defense of private property is really important. It's really important. That's central. If I don't own myself, if I don't own the fruit of my labor, then who does? Is it this government-sponsored monopoly? Is it, God forbid, Consumers Energy and DTE? Why on earth would they have the right to be protected by the state to make a profit that ordinary people don't have the ability to get and, moreover, have to pay for? And they don't even deliver the service on time. This is very easy to fix. Just simply take away the commission, take away the regulations that allow them to not face competition. And what you will see immediately is a massive surge in the number of power producers and utilities delivering directly to consumers. We need to build up more power lines. We need to build up options. We need to allow individuals and homes and families to produce the cheapest power they can possibly get. And we should not have these vast institutions that can lobby their way into getting the kind of profit margins that other businesses can only dream of. I mean, if you look at, again, it's the nature of incentives. The nature of it. If you want to know what people are going to do, look at the incentives that they've been offered. That's the reason to do economic thinking. This is increasingly clear to me. You see this in terms of all the things people complain about: housing, energy prices, medical care. Over and over and over again, you see the government's fingerprints all over these industries. Government protection automatically, axiomatically makes things more expensive, and it makes life harder for ordinary Americans. We should want that gone. Deregulation does not mean allowing force or fraud. In fact, we should crack down on those things much harder than we do right now. I'm a strong believer in firm rules for everyone, right? The danger that we have now is these regulatory agencies create laws that are not universally applicable. And they affect people unevenly, and they are vectors for ultimately the supposed targets of regulation to capture those institutions for their own benefit. And that's what's happened in Michigan in regards to power production. It's the reason things are so expensive here and the quality of service is so low. And again, I just think life could be so much better. It could be so much better. And the reason it's not is because of these entrenched interests and stupid moralizing by the ignorant and the ideological. So I hope that explanation was clear. I hope this has been educational in some way, that what I've done here today can help clarify the problem and some solutions going forward. That's always the goal of what I do here. Use your mind to figure out how problems work and then solve them. Don't just whine about problems, work to solve them. So again, I appreciate all of you listening here today. I'm interested in hearing your feedback as always. You can find me on X at @Lippincott. You can find me on Substack at Regime Critic. You can also find this podcast, Lippincott Talk, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on YouTube. This has been another episode. I can't wait to hear from you next time. This is Lippincott Talk.